Hello and welcome to the Beyond Podcast. And today it's another discussing episode. It's a relatively open-ended discussing episode from my point of view. I've got a title. I have a list of plays and some thoughts that will go into what we're going to be discussing with my wonderful guest, who I will ask to introduce themselves in just a moment. So the title I've got here is "You Can't Just Throw a Woman at It." I can't remember if there was an exclamation point on that or not. I think that, and I some of our readers in our exploring sessions might feel seen today, but hopefully they're not listening, so that'll be fine. So to discuss and elaborate on this particular talking point, I have with me my wonderful guest. Who are you, and what is your purpose in life?
Hello. My name's Nora Williams. I am, my job is that I'm the Associate Dean for Access and Participation at BIM University, which is a creative industries university in the UK. And my research self is that I am interested in all the ways that early modern drama shows up today, 400-ish years later. And I'm particularly interested in how we now today in our 21st century bodies and selves, as performers, as directors, as dramaturgs, whatever, interact with representations of violence and intimacy in the plays. So the book that I've just written, that we'll probably talk a little bit, but not exclusively about today, is about representations of sexual violence in plays by...
Yes, but we have a list of plays that are by other people.
They're much more interesting.
Yes, and as I said, the full title you emailed me was "You Can't Just Throw a Woman at It, Dramaturgical Misogyny in Early Modern Drama," which sort of covers that. So from our point of view as producers, this is something that we're constantly discussing. As our exploring sessions, we're constantly reading through plays, and the question is, what is the best self for this play? What is the best production? What are the options that plays give us? And the early modern period does throw us some really difficult texts. Some are easier than others. Very few of them are not without their production problems. Every so often you get a play and you go, oh, this is box fresh, just give it to some actors and tell them to learn their lines. And then there are texts where you're going, okay, decisions need to be made here. What do we do with this? What is a modern audience going to get out of it? And all of those production questions. And yes, so you're sort of engaging with that question as actively.
Yeah, very much so. And my background is that I trained as an actor originally, and I really, really wanted to be an actor, and then accidentally ended up with PhD funding. And now
I just hate it when that happens,
somehow.
I was looking down the back of the sofa.
Yeah, I know that makes it sound really, really linear, and it wasn't.
No, I'm sure it was actually rather hard work.
That's the short version. Is that actually what happened is that I moved to the UK to do a master's degree from the States, and I met the man who is now my husband, who I have a separate podcast with, and I had known him for about 6 months when the PhD funding opportunity came up, and I thought, this is a way I can stick around for another 3 or 4 years and see where this relationship goes. So, yeah, unfortunately, I did make big life choices for the sake of a boy I liked, which is not advice I would give anybody. But it worked out for us.
I'm trying now to think of an appropriate early modern play where that would apply to very leniently.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like any of the Middleton ones, right? Like, I think The Changeling is that, Women Beware Women is that, A Mad World by Masters is kind of that. Like, Middleton would say, do not make life choices based on boys you like. And I try not to follow advice from him generally, because I think he had a real problem with women, actually. But...
Well, that's sort of to a degree what we're here to discuss. Shall we start with The Changeling?
Yeah,
because you hate talking about The Changeling.
I know it's my least favorite thing.
I know it's a burden that I'm sure you'll bear with.
I know I might never forgive you for this.
Yeah. So, multi-author play.
Yes.
We've got Middleton. We've got Rowley.
I say Rowley usually, but we can't exactly ask him. So
no, we can't. But the opinions seem to vary. So I treat it like David Bowie.
Yes.
Bowie. Depending on your mood.
Yeah.
Anyway, The Changeling. Yeah, and most of the plays that you've mentioned are what we might call sort of effectively canon plays that people may have encountered somewhere. Productions of The Changeling do turn up. There are film and television versions that exist, and we've done an exploring session that is available as well. We haven't done a production of it yet, but it's out there. It's one of those key texts. So tell us, where are you at with The Changeling?
Yeah, that's always a complex question. And what's interesting about The Changeling is it's also been an A-level text since the mid-'80s. So it's a play that, like, not only may you have encountered it in the wild, you may have encountered it in school, which is, maybe a plus, maybe a negative, depending on your particular
It depends how well it's taught. Is a really interesting
it does.
question.
And I think it's a tough one to teach at A-level, probably, because so much of it is just gross innuendo. So how do you, in a way, I think probably, 16, 17, 18-year-olds might engage with that. And I was lucky enough that in my school, when I was younger, we were taught "'Tis pity she's a whore," actually. And we found that so much more exciting than any of the stuff by the other guy that we had read, because it just felt, I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic now, but I think Ford's poetry, because it's being written in that Caroline period where there's loads of throwbacks to the sort of 1590s style of doing things, it's a little bit less dense than some of the heavy earlier 17th century stuff. So it felt very sort of accessible and fresh to us in a way that other things we had read hadn't. The kind of big tragedies didn't really resonate in quite the same way. And also it's about teenagers being in love, and so what that they're brother and sister. That felt sort of scandalous and exciting to us.
And it doesn't hang around either. "'Tis pity she's a whore" that basically starts with this, "Hi, I'm really hot for my sister. Is that okay?" Yeah. To a priest who goes, not really. I mean, I think the priest does actually bear a lot of responsibility for what goes down, because you kind.
Thank you.
He does because he just sort of just pray for a bit. He doesn't. There's no decent safeguarding procedures in place at all with this guy.
He could have. He does at least say, "No, you shouldn't do that." Which Putana, who's his kind of equivalent on Annabella's side, is sort of like, "Yeah, go for it. Your brother's hot." So, it's a little, the other thing about "'Tis Pity" that I think makes it great to teach to younger students is that it's all one plot.
Yes.
There's no, there's various different people and suitors involved that come in and out and sort of have their own things going on, but it's all this, it's really all the marriage plot in one shape or another, which I think makes it just a little bit easier to keep up with if you're not used to reading these kinds of texts.
Yes, and as you were saying, the verse is it's good verse, it's good text to look at, but it isn't opaque. It isn't. The playwright is not showing off in the same way as I feel with other plays where it's just going. The syntax now is so slippery. I have no idea what you're talking about. Which Middleton.
I mean, I was going to say, that does take us right back to The Changeling, doesn't it? Yeah. So The Changeling it's a love-hate play for me. Like I have spent a lot of time with it. My PhD thesis was about The Changeling exclusively, so I really went deep rather than broad and looked at the relationship between print performance and archival histories in that play's life. And I got really hung up on, because I come from a drama context, the fact that there were no productions for over 300 years professionally in the UK. So that it's really popular throughout the 17th century. And we can see the popularity, I think, in the fact that it's printed for the first time during the Civil Wars when the theaters are closed. It comes back with the theater coming back, so it's in the first season of plays in 1660-61, and then it disappears. And it's just, it's kind of a sort of academic curiosity for quite a long time. There's a really interesting adaptation of it called Beatrice Juana from the 19th century. And that one, interestingly, bears much more resemblance to the source text than it does to the Middleton and Rowley play. So I'm actually partly convinced that author hadn't actually read or wasn't particularly engaging with the play. They were engaging with the source. And then in the 60s, it comes roaring back. And it suddenly is popular again, and is kind of, being performed in its first 20th century production is at the Royal Court, which really surprised me. And this may not be news to your listeners, and certainly not to you. I'm probably telling you things you already know, but that to me was a really interesting moment in the research where I was like, so this is being treated like new writing, right? It's being put in a context. It's being given to a director. It's being given to actors who are known for their work on new writing, right? It's the same director as Look Back in Anger. So, and the same theater. So you're going, whoa, of all the places I would have expected this to pop up in 1961, the Royal Court is not it. And that really got me thinking about, what's appealing about this play to that context and to that moment and to that group of people. And it has a real little flurry of interest in the late 70s, where there are, I think, 5 productions all in the same season at different theaters. And again, you're going like, okay, so what, sometimes these things are inscrutable and you're just like, they all went to the same university and they studied it in the same class, and they thought, this is, there's no rights on this. I don't have to pay for it. The theater's in financial trouble. I guess we'll do this. But I think there's something too about, the starting point for that research was thinking about the way that difficult plays speak to difficult times. Because I do think The Changeling's a difficult play.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just on that sort of its disappearance and its reappearance, I mean, after the Restoration, you get a good, 30 years of, experimentation where stuff can be quite dark, and then pretty much the shutters come down on the darkness, and everything becomes a bit moralistic and sentimental, and it goes through various different waves over the centuries as theatre does things that are much more interested in aesthetics than sometimes they are about, being about something in a deep way, which is not, I don't have a problem with. I quite like entertainment. And then something starts happening in the 19th century, but late 19th century where, content becomes king. But it still has those barriers. A lot of the plays that reappear in the 50s and 60s are the ones that are quite dark and bloody and nasty. And that seems to be, again, to do with this wave of pushing against censorship, various different kinds of civil rights issues are sort of coming to the forefront. And these plays that are doing something darker about society, especially after the Second World War, I think that's something that's going on there in the cultural moment. And anything to do with sexual politics as well. I mean, it happens in television, in British television especially, in the late 60s, early 70s especially, is everyone sort of goes, women. And
we exist.
Yeah, well, and we should be doing stuff about women. They don't hire any women to produce these things, I should point out.
No, never, of course not.
So you have this very odd cultural moment where everything is very much about what we might call feminist issues, but they're all produced by rather ham-fisted men. So they end up being incredibly misogynistic as well. And that's, I think, where this fits quite neatly into that question, I think.
Yeah,
is that
definitely.
There's something happening in the culture, but the actual cultural producers haven't actually caught up with the structural problem that they are a part of, if that makes sense. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that is absolutely part of what's happening here, right? Is that people have gone, ooh, we should talk about things that affect women. And I think people, this has always been true, but I think the kind of gear shift of capitalism in the 20th century as well takes us to a place where people who want to make money realize that women are a big demographic who buy things. And the marketing to women, even if the content is still pretty misogynist, is really lucrative, right? Because as a gender, I think we foolishly hold on to the hope that someday people will get it. I think it's the 60s and 70s are super, super interesting. I think partly for how the decisions and the kind of cultural things that were happening then still sit with us in the present and are still, not to make it about US politics, because that's a whole can of worms, particularly at the moment. But I think the fact that we're back to things like whether abortion should be legal, and off the back of that, whether access to birth control should be available for everybody. And actually, even this week, you have US senators saying, I don't think mixed race marriages should be legislated by the federal government. I think that should be up to individual states. So there's a kind of return, I think, to a lot of the racial politics, the gender politics, and the kind of questions that were active in society. I almost said 40 years ago. My God, I still think that 1980 was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I will forever.
Yeah. Past, no, it's fine.
In the middle of the 20th century, in the mid 1900s, as my students would say, that are recurrent currently, and I think probably have been recurrent at various different times, because and I think the Changeling shows us this really effectively, right? Power wants to hold on to power, and those who have power structurally in a society tend to find ways to undermine any advancement of another group that is trying to equalize the playing field. And that is where I think I didn't quite get there with my thesis work on the Changeling, but I'm thinking much more about it now, and certainly with the second project in the book. I'm really keen that we think about things like misogyny and things like patriarchy as systemic problems, right? So it's not necessarily about the behavior of individual people, although individual people obviously can be, I've met some of them, can be horrifically misogynist. But this is Kate Mann's work from her really excellent book, Down Girl, which is sort of the first academic attempt to theorize misogyny as something that is connected to but different from patriarchy. So she's sort of going, we have the Greek etymology of this word, right? Misogyny is hatred of women. She said, but I think actually it's more useful for us to think about it as something that is about systems of power, and misogyny being what she calls the law enforcement arm of patriarchy. So it's the way that social interactions kind of orient themselves towards the maintenance of a patriarchal world in ways that often are unconscious. So we're not necessarily aware that we're doing this. And this is where I want to be super, super clear that I actually do think Middleton was probably personally misogynist. But a lot of the time when I'm talking about what's happening in these plays, I'm not trying to say that your fave from the 16th or 17th century was misogynist, right? I'm saying the plays are written in such a way that they uphold a patriarchal worldview. And that may or may not have been intentional. I have no way of knowing, because I can't dig these guys up and ask them, just like we don't actually know how Rowley Rowley might have pronounced his name.
Yeah. Well, and the Changeling is a very good text for that for a number of reasons. One is it's a partly contradictory text. If you're trying to follow the central female character's arc, it is not quite clear what the playwrights are doing there. But also in the way the play has been, was interpreted for most of the 20th century. If you're looking at commentaries, you're looking at the people discussing it, there's a big disconnect with what happens in the play and what people say happens in the play.
Yes.
And this is again that gap that we're talking about as well for anyone producing it now. Is, of course, there is the play text and there is the play production. What wiggle room do we have in between in terms of what we're creating today? And I'd say the Changeling, because it is, there are some big confusing things in it that that throw you in very different directions. Not least that there's an A-B plot that is largely unconnected with itself, but also just through the through lines of the characters. Because modern actors do quite like a through line, and there isn't necessarily one. That things just change.
Yeah, and this is this is something I talk about in the book too, right? That I think the way that most of us are trained as actors now is very much in the shadow of Stanislavski, right? Like whether you actually had kind of Meisner training or not, you're living in this world where what we're after as actors is a kind of verisimilitude, is a sort of, true to life representation of a person. And I don't think that the early modern playwrights were thinking that way most of the time. Even the much touted invention of the human doesn't actually do that. So the trying to reconcile that sort of post-Stanislavskian impulse to find motivation for your characters and to find a through line for your character and to find this sort of, super objective or whatever, it doesn't really play nicely with a lot of these plays. And I think that's where a lot of productions get into trouble, is that they're trying to reconcile a set of things within a naturalism, a naturalistic approach to, or sort of broadly naturalistic approach to performance, when that's not what the play does or is.
No.
And you can end up tying yourself in knots that way.
It was interesting because we were doing the game at chess, which
great example of this.
Where you get about 2/3 through the play and then suddenly it just goes batshit crazy, and you're going, why is any of this happening?
Yeah.
And, I remember spending quite a lot of time with three members of the cast going, and they're sort of going, why am I doing this? And I'm just going, because...
because that's what serves the plot at this moment.
Because that's what's doing it. And the thing, actually, having now performed it live all the way through, as an audience member, it's weird. It's fine.
Yeah.
It makes it. I mean, it doesn't make it makes the sort of sense that you're on the journey home in the car afterwards, going, hang on, why did that happen? But it's only after the show's over. It doesn't jar in the way that on the page there are bits in Game at Chess where you're going, magic mirror, why now? But actually in production it was.
You're just like, okay, yeah.
And even though underlying this moment in the play is something really, really unpleasant, it was actually a hilarious scene. The audience thought it was very, very funny, which either means we succeeded or we failed. I haven't decided which.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes that laughter is coming from a place of shock as well, right? Where you're like, oh, really? Have I understood this?
But that's a much lighter play than the Changeling is, which is pretty.
Overall.
I mean, even the comedy in the Changeling.
It's awful.
Dark as hell.
It's
I mean,
awful,
it
and it
is.
really. So I'm going to come out. I mean, I have already said this publicly, and I doubt I will ever meet Mr. Drumgoole, so I think I can say this. I hated the most recent Globe production in the Sam Wanamaker, and part of the reason it was so bad is that I think what Drumgoole was trying to do was to lean into what would have been funny about the Madhouse plot in its so-called original context, and as a result, the whole production was asking us to find really dire expressions of mental illness hilarious, in a way that certainly was not a laughing with, right? And I really found that deeply unsettling, and it struck me as a kind of, and I think the Globe gets away with this a lot, a kind of hiding behind this veneer of authenticity, right? Of being like, well, this is how it would have been, so it's okay. And I'm really not on board with that argument.
I mean, this is the thing. When we did Game at Chess, we had 45 minutes of going, hi, we're now going to explain to you the political and social context of this.
Yeah.
And yes, you may now relax and find some of these jokes hilarious. But you have been loaded up with that context. Now, if I was doing a production of Game at Chess, which would be just presented to an audience without priming, it would be a very, very different beast, because you'd have to build into it a framing narrative, which I kind of think I can do. I have a plan.
Ooh.
Whether I can square the circle, I don't quite know.
Yeah, and whether the plan works in practice, right? Yeah. I think that's the other, and this is something where I think early modernist academics who do not have a theater background get tied up in knots themselves, is where they'll be like, oh, but it's so clear on the page that this is where my analysis of this is like, first of all, 0 audience members, or like maybe 0.1% of audience members have the depth of knowledge of this play that you, as somebody who's read it 1,000 times, have. That's not how this interaction works. And even if they do, I think academic thinking, this is how I talk about it to practice as research students when I'm trying to explain, why it's so difficult to sit at that intersection of research and practice often. And it's because research is about opening up questions, right? It's about sort of going, what if, and kind of walking around an idea and looking at it from lots of different angles and maybe not ever answering the question. When you're working on a production, you got to make choices at some point. Yeah. and you sort of have to commit to those choices, and those choices show up in performance in ways that maybe contradict some of the ideas that you had in the big expansive discussion sessions at the start, in your table work or in your exploratory phase or in your your early devising or whatever it is, and that's really, really challenging. And I think loads of academics don't understand that part of the process,
and also that people don't always appreciate that I mean, it's this question: if misogyny happens in a play and nobody notices, is it still there? The point is, yes, it is.
Yeah.
And that's sort of kind of the point when these things are running underneath the surface, and they're not being pointed out on some level. But also that audiences change. I mean, it's this idea that something that worked in the 60s, where they might have got away with X or Y jokes, and those jokes don't land anymore. There was a production of Private Lives recently where there was a line cut from the production. I don't know when they cut the line from the production, because it was about, wives should be beaten regularly like gongs.
Yes.
And I don't know whether they cut that in rehearsal. I don't know whether they cut that after the first couple of previews, because the thing's a comedy. People are supposed to laugh. And you know what? People don't laugh at that joke anymure.
No, as they shouldn't.
and this is sometimes what happens when you get people talking about all these things, all these social issues being foisted on us, and going, no, the audiences are telling us we can't do this anymore.
Yeah,
we actually are reacting to you, not always the other way around.
Right.
And when that happens in that process, and this question, I think one of the problems with a lot of these plays, less so perhaps for The Changeling or The Duchess of Malfi, is they are performed just about regularly enough for these questions to be teased out in practice.
Yes.
And that for other people to have seen that practice and gone, oh, good God, I'm not doing that, is that these plays aren't performed often enough, so that when you're performing them, you're finding out what the audience reaction is. That's sort of the point of our process. And that's the thing, is I've done Game at Chess once in one context. I'd like to do it again in another context to find out what we can keep and what we can't.
Yeah.
And the same applies to The Changeling or to 'Tis Pity She's a Whore. I mean, a lot of these plays we're discussing here are tragedies. They do have an advantage in that a lot of horrible people die horribly, and that is quite enjoyable. But that isn't a solution necessarily, is it?
Yeah, and I think where... again, this is a soapbox that I have been standing on for a while. But I think what is tough about plays like The Duchess of Malfi, like The Changeling, like Women Beware Women, for example, like The Witch of Edmonton, there are these impossibly cool women from our 21st century point of view who are at the front of these plays, right? The Duchess of Malfi is a badass. Victoria from The White Devil, I want to be her friend. And so, hopefully without the murders. Thinking also about Artemisia from The Birth of Merlin, which is my all-time favorite early modern play, which I told you I would shoehorn in, and I did.
Yeah, no, I'm very happy. Well, I've got a note. We'll circle round to Birth of Merlin, because I think we should.
Merlin. But there's these extremely cool women who are very much through our eyes are in the kind of empowered model of femininity, right? This kind of fourth wave feminism, like taking the bull by the horns, taking no shit, making choices for herself, living her life. Without exception, they get horrifically punished for that behavior, right? And even in the comedies, right? Even in something like A Chaste Maid in Cheapside, the resolution of that is a heterosexual marriage that works out better than anyone could have hoped. The end of The Tamer Tamed, right, is marital harmony. And yes, in some senses, that's a genre convention, and that ends that way because it has to. But I think with our analytical eyes and with our kind of 21st century eyes, we can look at that and go, okay, two things are happening at once here, right? There's this woman who is from our perspective, is deeply cool. The problem is she's sitting in the midst of a society and of a culture that's being presented on stage where, you know, the end of the Changeling, right? When Beatrice Joanna's dying and she literally compares herself to sewage, right? She's like, I belong in the gutter. And De Flores gets to say, haha, I raped your wife, I win. So he gets to be triumphant, and she is totally diminished and literally objectified, right? Like, she refers to herself as it in that last speech. That is a problem for me, for us thinking of these as cool, empowered women, because their ultimate end is horrific. And again, yes, that's a tragic genre convention. But I do think productions have to grapple with that and have to think about, okay, what's our comment on this, right? Because if we just present this as is, and I think for plays, as you've said, like Duchess, like Changeling, like 'Tis Pity, that get performed fairly regularly, and this is Lucy Monroe's argument, right, that they're now kind of part of this alternative canon. That is, unfortunately, a kind of endorsement of that story, right? If we present it as is in some of the best known theaters in the country and in the world, in a kind of uncritical way, and if we teach it in schools in a kind of uncritical way, and so I think, you know, there's no one size fits all solution for this, and this is what my article in the first chapter of the book on incomplete dramaturgy is kind of trying to pinpoint, right? Is this thing of like, say you did a production of 'Tis Pity where Giovanni was played by a woman.
Oh yes, we're circling around to the title of this episode.
We're coming around the long way.
Yeah.
Say, you know, you could do that. I think it would be interesting. I think that casting change alone does not make that play any less misogynist, because the misogyny is in the structure of the society that it's reflecting and creating, right? It's in the logic of the play. It's in the assumptions that it makes. It's in the dramaturgy, which is the argument of the book.
Yes,
so
and I would argue it kind of misses the point of what, you know, because if you want to highlight and demonstrate to an audience that this is a misogynistic, patriarchal society, you kind of need the men to be there as part of that, and that. One of the thoughts about framing this, when I was thinking about, you know, in comparison with, say, horror as a genre, we talk about these as tragedies. So, you know, these Duchess of Malfi is a horror.
It's horrific.
And you know, this whole society is framed against her and works against her. You know, her entire family, everybody is, even people to a degree who are supposedly on her side. Everybody is angled in that fashion, and that much more and Changeling, I think, has that in there as well, in a more overt way, in the imagery of where it's set and the way that's framed at the very beginning of the play. But does that, you know, how do you bring that out in a production? How do you emphasize and demonstrate that without being? I mean, this is the thing: is you want to demonstrate it, but you also don't want to be too. What's the word I'm stretching for here? Sometimes you can make your point more so forceful that the production sort of gets lost somewhere behind it. And you can. Where's the balance on that front?
Yeah, and I think when we're talking about these types of plays too, people tend to get hung up on a sense of loyalty to the text as they conceive it as well, which actually I usually point to a game at chess when someone brings me that argument, and I'm like, oh, the text, the authorial intention, which one, friend? Which one?
Yeah.
Because 6 manuscripts, Middleton touched all of them. So which of these would you say?
Yes. Could you please state precisely how long you think a play lasted in the early modern period? for us to decide how long this play should be and where the cuts live. Because,
Yeah.
you know what, I think a lot of these were too long.
Yeah.
And are
Yeah.
the author's director's cut, I mean, Ben Jonson especially, you know,
yeah.
where you're going, I don't know what the play is in this, because this isn't a play anymore. He's turned it into something else.
Right.
Ironically, because he was aiming for posterity, and because of that, he's sort of screwed his own legacy. Bless him.
My favorite Ben Jonson is his annotations on his civic pageants and his masks, where he's like in the margins, literally going, "In case you don't understand Latin, this is."
He's not alone in that for civic pageantry.
Yeah.
I mean, that's my favourite bit is in civic pageantry is Thomas Hayward when he goes, and then on this pageant station there was some singing and dancing, but I didn't write that bit, and it's all very silly. And it's not really about anything, so I'm not going to tell you anything about it. However, I am going to complain about it for about 2 paragraphs.
We had to have some singing and dancing, I guess.
We had to put something in fun, and I said no, but the committee said yes, and, you know.
It's good to know committees have been annoying forever.
Well, I think in this case, the committee was bloody right. Thank you for your innovating verse, Mr. Hayward.
Yes.
So we've drifted. Where
That's
were
right.
we? We were on because we're talking mostly about tragedies where and these sort of nightmare worlds and how do we balance that? I think there's an interesting challenge when talking about comedies where the problem is that the structure of the comedy is misogynistic.
Yeah.
So if take a play like Two Angry Women of Abingdon, which has a great opening scene. I absolutely adore the opening scene. It's one of my. It's in isolation. I think it's absolutely fab, and I think it's psychologically astute. As two women play a game of backgammon and get so annoyed, bet with each other, and get so annoyed with each other that they just become enemies for life. And I appreciate that probably comes from a misogynistic place, but it's so well done. And then you get into the rest of the play where the misogyny just creeps out of the dramaturgy more and more because, of course, what is the play about? It's about the men being terribly reasonable about these two very unreasonable women. How are we going to sort them out? Oh, well, we're going to work behind their back and it'll all be sorted in the end. Rah. And you're sort of going, oh, I really liked this play, and then it just sort of turned to shit in my hands. And I don't know how to do anything. And I don't know what to do with it because... unless you basically rewrite Acts 4 and 5, and with most comedies, that's kind of the only solution.
Yeah.
Because the endings are often tragedies. Because what's the solution to a romantic comedy? Well, the really empowered, interesting woman gets married to a dick.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or the person who sexually assaulted her.
Yay! Wins for everyone.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating, and it's so... You know, I think even where the cool and interesting woman gets to marry who she wants, she's setting the bar super low for herself a lot of the time. Like, these dudes are just not that interesting. And there's, I struggle with it. And I think, you know, so The Witch of Edmonton was on my list of plays to talk about today. And I love this play. It's one of my favorites. I think it teaches super well. And I think we don't talk enough about poor Susan, who is, accidentally a bigamist.
Yeah.
and truly accidentally. Although also she made bad life choices for the sake of a boy she liked. So, you know, I don't...
People do make bad decisions.
People do this. We've all had that boyfriend, right? You know, we've all...
You know, that is allowed.
It's allowed.
And in fact, it is the driver of almost all drama on some level of a bad decision is made for some reason.
Right. For the sake of, and so, you know, so for those who don't know the play, Frank marries Winifred, who is pregnant with his child, but then also at the same time marries Susan, who doesn't know that Winifred exists, and thinks he's going to get away with this by stealing Susan's dowry to run away with Winifred, who's dressed as a page boy. Now, her pregnancy is to the point of being obvious, which we know from the stage direction it says enter Winifred with child. So, and not like a babe in arms, like she's pregnant, as in she's with child. So it's a how this disguise is supposed to function, I'm not quite sure. But Frank is touched by the devil, and instead of just stealing Susan's dowry, he murders her horrifically instead. And you know Ford wrote this plot because it goes from 0 to murder very quickly.
Yes, multiple authors for Witch of Edmonton,
multiple authors on Witch of Edmonton.
But you can. The fingerprints are pretty clear, I think, through who's most of the way through it. You can feel the gear changes, and you can feel that bit's by. Yeah, I can see where that's coming from.
And Cuddy Banks is so obviously a Rowleyan clown. Who I have a lot of time for Cuddy Banks, actually. I think he's one of the Witch of Edmonton has some really like wholesome male role models in it. And I think Cuddy Banks is among them. I have a growing appreciation for him over time.
Another example of a play that on paper doesn't quite look right, but actually flows perfectly well. I think that's the thing. It's juggling a lot of plots, a lot of incident. We haven't even mentioned the actual Witch of Edmonton herself. Which is where most people hair off to straight away. But yeah, the way those plots intersect is quite interesting because they give you contrast to things that are happening via the devil or via social concerns that push you towards the devil, and the way that functions, because the devil isn't a catch-all get-out here.
No,
people you are. If we're going in a sort of Twin Peaks vibe, you are with the devil, but you are not driven by the devil.
Yes, and the devil can say no, which I think is super interesting as well. He's autonomous, which I guess completely makes sense when you consider who the devil is supposed to be in that mythology. So, it's totally logical that the devil gets to pick and choose which things he wants to get involved with and which things he doesn't, and who he chooses to appear to or speak to, and who he just kind of influences from the shadows.
I mean, clearly he's going, there's no point in doing anything with you because you're nice, but there's a slither of resentment I can use to wrench open a dramatic situation.
Yes, I can exploit this, but it's one of my favorite scenes, I think, in all of early modern drama, the bit where Cuddy Banks is saying to him, just be my dog. We can just hang out and I'll steal food for you and we can be buds. And the dog is going, mate, what do you not understand? I'm the devil.
Yeah.
I can't just hang out with you.
Alas, that would be such a good buddy movie.
I know, wouldn't it?
Cuddy Banks and the devil on a road trip.
I'd watch it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so poor Susan gets murdered for her husband's misadventures. And as she's dying, she has this very long speech, where she goes on and on about how death is her husband now, and she's going to come as a virgin to him, to death, because she would have lived in the sin of bigamy. Like, so she's basically saying, this is a merciful death. This is the right thing for you to have done, Frank, because I wouldn't have wanted to live as a whore, basically. And it would have been so much worse for me in the afterlife if I had lived a really long time and not known that you had this other woman. And you know what? I forgive you, Frank. You can't see this because we're verbal, but I'm gesticulating in disbelief. It's super interesting to me to contrast that with the witch's speech, with Mother Sawyer's speech right before she goes to the gallows, in which she is pretty defiant, right? She's still pretty much like, you all were wrong the whole time. And her sort of bit of moralizing before she goes off to be hanged is, beware how you trust the devil. But it's, the kind of moral heart of the play. And again, I think this is very Dekker to me. It has that influence from Thomas Dekker, is that it's the social circumstances of her life that drive her to her evil. But in the end, she's the one that gets punished. Right? So she's there's no sense that like what we need to do is support Mother Sawyer as a community so she doesn't feel she needs the devil. And again, I think that's a very modern way of looking at it, right? Like the sense of mental health and those sorts of things is not accurate to the period. But yeah, there's a kind of contradiction in there, right? Where it's like we can see that what the play is asking us to see is that Mother Sawyer has been pushed into these circumstances by the way that everyone mistreats her. And everyone keeps saying she's a witch. And I love that line, "'Tis all one to be a witch as to be counted one." And then the devil appears.
Yes.
But she doesn't get there on her own, right? She's kind of pushed in that direction by the circumstances. But it's still she who pays the price in the end. And actually it's Anne Radcliffe who's the only other death at the hands of the devil, isn't it? The rest is corn and cattle and non-human entities. Although Molly Hand has a great article about how we dismiss the non-human deaths in that play.
Oh yeah, this is potentially the end of your livelihood if your animals are all dying. I mean, that's one of the reasons why such an accusation had such weight.
Yes.
In real life.
Yeah, yeah.
And that intersection also between true story and fiction, how they are functioning in that sense.
Yeah.
If you look at something like Arden of Faversham, where it's a hilarious comedy until you get to the end and they all get sentenced for to in her case burn, because it's petty treason. And of course you're going, oh no, hang on, they all did die horribly, didn't they?
Yeah.
This is suddenly not a comedy. It's because it functions like a comedy for 90% of the time, and then you have this thunk on the back of the head in the last three scenes when they finally do the murder, and the murder is horrible. And then they get caught really quickly by CSI local
CSI Faversham.
Yeah, it is CSI. I mean, actually, that's something really interesting about some of the crime and true crime plays is that their forensic skills are really good.
Yeah, like
genuinely.
the Thatch on Fire.
Yeah. Just looking at the evidence. I forget which one it is. Is it the Two Lamentable Tragedies, where not only does the local CSI get together and find all the clues, but also the body is found by someone walking their dog. It might be a different play, I forget.
Oh, that's very CSI.
It's this thing. So the body's always found by someone walking their dog. That's the thing, and it's just like, wow, this is a really old trope.
But I think too about, it's been ages since I read it, but A Woman Killed with Kindness has a similar sort of pattern, doesn't it? Where it's supposed to be funny up until the point where she literally is dying. Yeah,
and that might be where I may be conflating my true, semi-true crime narratives together. Could be from Warning to Fair Women. I can't remember. But yeah, the when you're looking at the way the punishments are meted out. And again, that's where you need the society around those moments on stage. You need those people who are complicit through inaction. If someone's being executed at the end of the play and basically it's society's fault, well, you kind of need all the happy, the people who survived and turned out reasonably happy at the end of The Witch of Edmonton, standing there doing nothing.
Yeah.
Actually, at that point, and asking those questions about what's going on there.
And there's, I think that kind of takes me around to thinking about where in the dramaturgical structure do we see that misogyny? So it's not necessarily just about kind of plot points of who gets murdered and what but one of the things that I have a chapter on in the book, where I really want to write the article, or it might end up being another book that looks at this for, all the much cooler playwrights. But there's a pattern that I have noticed in plays of this period where we tend to get direct address from perpetrators of things like sexual violence before that thing happens. And then we tend to get direct address from the victims of things like sexual violence, the survivors, after the thing has happened. And what I notice about that, and this was in relation to a specific play that I won't get into now, but what that to me encourages, and of course audiences are made up of individuals, right? So there's of course room here for resistant spectatorship and oppositional spectatorship and all those things. But what the structure of the play encourages, if you're not sort of alert to this, is that you enter the scene of violence through the eyes of the perpetrator. And so their logic is what's kind of present in your mind's eye as that scene is unfolding. And even for somebody who, is alert to these things and is aware of these things, it took me quite a long time to be able to articulate what was going on there, right? And to be able to articulate that problem of, the specific example I'm thinking of, a lot of the scholarship misses the point that the victim had no idea this was coming.
There is an attempt to get the audience on some level excited and with anticipation as to something that is about to happen. Yeah, absolutely.
And where we get speeches in direct address from women prior to that kind of moment of abjection, those women tend to be the ones that are getting punished later. Yeah. So I think about the Duchess of Malfi, for example, or, Beatrice Joanna gets to speak. But actually the very first thing that happens in The Changeling is Alcimero speaking to the audience, right? The first lines of the play are a soliloquy for him. And De Flores gets a soliloquy at the end of that scene. So we have these two masculine perspectives framing our introduction to this character. And that pattern, I think, continues through the whole play. And even where, Middleton and asides is a whole thing, right? That's a whole seven. I have written about this before. But that scene between Beatrice and De Flores, where they're, talking around each other, and we get all these asides. I really want to go back to that kind of with this new lens to say, what's happening here? What is this an example of something else? Is this part of this trend? What's happening structurally around that in other parts of the play? Whereas and I'm thinking even in the Madhouse plot, it's Isabella, isn't it? Is her name? She gets to speak to the audience after that attempted assault from Lolio, doesn't she? And after the kind of implied kiss with Antonio. So there's this kind of, there's something for me, and I think I didn't get all the way to articulating this in the way I wanted in the book, which is also why I want to come back to it. There's something there for me about feminine speech and the way that is constructed in period. And the way that these female characters seem to be freed to speak to the audience and to kind of cultivate that relationship or kind of try to create that relationship only when their sort of purity, if you like, in the kind of construct of the time has been compromised in some way. And there's something there for me still that I'm kind of walking around and thinking about that I'm not quite kind of articulating exactly how I want to yet.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. Some which are structural, some which are just sort of thinking about the people writing these things. And, what is your game plan when you're doing a play? Well, what you want to do is create as much excitement and build up and using this sort of dramatic irony technique to create situations where you can build anticipation and then you can have payoff. And the question of the personnel doing that as well. Because there's something also, and I haven't done a proper analysis of this, it's just something that's come out of reading 600 odd plays, is that I don't know if the boy actors are needed for the jig, but the female parts fade out. There is a distinct, they start off with a bang, and we're all going, oh, this is going great, and then we call it the curse of the final session. They disappear. And I don't know if it's a doubling thing. People sometimes disappear in the middle of a play because they've got to play some bit part and come back on again later. But these roles which are quite would require complicated costume changes, where so that kind of doubling doesn't necessarily fully make sense, and they're usually there in the final scene, especially in a comedy when everybody turns up again at the end.
Yeah.
Is it a distrust of giving those actors too much to do? Is those scenes of abjection something that maybe they consider that the boys are very good at, and that there's a certain logic there of you can give him that, which are all sort of Doyleist external things of going, well, what might be some of the reasons for why these choices are happening, not just once, not just with the same author, but across multiple authors over quite a long period of time. And also the differentiation between what's happening in the Elizabethan and the Jacobean. The Jacobean seems to be, and again, I'm wondering if it's a bit like the 1970s, of suddenly, we don't have a queen anymore. That something happens there. It all becomes so much more blokey. But then maybe they're going, well, there's a lot of sexual violence out there. We should be writing lots of plays about this. But because they're all men, they're not doing it very well, and they all fall into the traps that we've seen in more modern culture. I don't know if any of that is true. I'm just just throwing those thoughts out there because that's sort of a series of trends that I'm sort of seeing shapes over time. Yeah.
I think we should never ever discount the power of pure practicality in terms of decision making around performance, right? There's, however we try to justify it academically, intellectually, creatively later, lots and lots and lots of choices get made in any production, probably at any point in history, that are purely practical. That are just, this person is available on this day to rehearse, so they're going to get the part and this other person isn't. Yeah. Or these are the costumes that we have, so this is the aesthetic that we're going for. We only have the theater for this many days, so we can't do anything complex in terms of the staging because we just won't have time to get it right. Whatever it is. And that affects playwrights too, obviously. I have this many actors in the company. This is how many roles I need. So these doubling considerations have to be part of my calculation of how this play comes together. Or they write it the way they want to, and then they take it to the company, and the company says, great, we literally physically can't do that. Yes,
cut this, cut that. Or just the calculation of it just seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, and then you find out that,
not.
Apprentice 6 is playing 12 roles somehow and talking to himself in 3 scenes.
Yeah.
So I think that is always a consideration. I think the question of whether these are like awareness raising efforts on the part of playwrights is unanswerable, right? Yeah. It goes back to intentionality, which we can't establish. And I sort of cheat this a little bit by just always saying what I'm interested in is how these things are showing up for us in the present. Yeah. So it's a kind of presentist argument that says whatever Rowley, Middleton, Dekker, whoever, Ford was thinking at the time, what's showing up for us now is having these kinds of effects.
Yeah. And some of it seems like it's commenting on it. Doesn't matter, as long as it seems, then we can do something with it as well. And there's an opportunity to be gained from that. So we said we were going to talk about Birth of Merlin. Let's talk about the Birth of Merlin, because Birth of Merlin does some very interesting things, especially about female agency, because, and a couple of plays have done similar things actually. I cannot remember their title off the top of my head, but of late we've had a couple of plays where some choices are made which are outside of the mean, as it were. Birth of Merlin's a bit bonkers as a play.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's why I love it. I mean, I have a real attraction to plays that on paper kind of don't make sense, because I think there's then a lot of fun and a lot of scope as a performer or a director to make some interesting choices with it, and to be creative and to think about how on earth are we going to drop a rock on Proximus's head, where are we going to get 2 dragons from, all the all these kind of set piece moments that Birth of Merlin has. But I also think it's a super interesting play to me because part of what it says to me is that female agency is terrifying, right? The idea that Joan went into the woods, found a guy, had some sex, and now she's giving birth to the devil. No, she's giving birth to Merlin, but his father is the devil, right? That guy turned out to be the devil. And Merlin, for all that he is, a hero of folklore, is kind of terrifying.
Yeah, because it's a small child who talks with the intelligence of an adult, and
who's
all
born
of
with a beard.
We're born with a beard.
Has an incredible command of magic.
Yes.
And who, the minute he's born, Joan becomes he becomes Joan's caretaker, right, rather than the other way around. And so there's I think there is a sort of tongue-in-cheek maybe, but a cautionary tale in there that, if you go down to the woods today, be careful you don't end up sleeping with the devil. And we're encouraged to kind of laugh at how stupid Joan is, right? Like, how could she not have noticed? Or she saw his cloven feet. How did she not know? How does she not know who the father of her child is, right? Like, that's the running joke of
and who can we persuade to take up paternity, which is an ongoing project from the family.
Yep. And then Artemisia as well is, I think she's fabulous, right? That's a phoenix death and glorious as a response to you're going to get burned at the stake is astonishing. But she is terrifying. She's terrifying for how she disrupts the family relationships, right, between the brothers. She's terrifying for how she disrupts the order of succession. She's terrifying for how she arrives, and the whole, even just on the page, the whole center of gravity of the room reorients around her the minute she's in the room.
Yes.
And that is terrifying to the dudes in charge, right?
Yes. And the whole play is about a very unstable project. Those closing prophecies are basically going, it's all gonna go very slowly tits up. Basically, it's all just going to fall apart. It's not going to happen all at once, and there's going to be a high point. But you know what? Everything you're doing is kind of going to turn to ash eventually.
He must have been having a bad week.
But I think there's something really elegiac about the way that the ending sort of functions as well. But not necessarily a negative one as well. That you there will be great moments. There are great things coming up, and and that you have this wonderful discussion about should you get married or should you just go to a convent? And you know what? Should we choose a convent?
Yeah,
I kind of fancy that. You know what? It might be a bit less shit.
And again, the agency, even though it's played for laughs, right? The agency of those characters is disruptive to the patriarchal order. The minute you give them a choice, they don't want to get married and have babies.
No, yeah.
They want to go to the convent.
Yeah.
And
I agree. It's an absolutely stonking play. I know there are challenges, but go for it. Dragons.
Yeah,
who doesn't
why
like
not
a dragon?
have some fun?
Yeah.
I keep trying to convince one of our local theaters here in Colchester that they want to let me direct it, and so far it's not.
Well, as I frequently say, we are infinitely bribable. For all our listeners out there, the advantage with audio is I don't have to worry about affording dragons. I can just go.
Yeah, make a sound effect.
Yeah. So, and as an opening gambit, and of course, if it goes well and lots of people like it, then it leads towards potential productions and further down the line. So if you want it, tell us. More importantly, throw us some money. It doesn't have to be a lot of money. It's amazing how things can start happening with small pebbles. Be a small pebble.
Amounts of money. Yes, as I said to a committee recently, I come from theatre. However much money there is, I'll make it work.
Yeah, and actually local markets. I mean, Colchester's not a bad shout for that, but you're going to say, why aren't they doing Bonduca?
Actually,
there's plenty of plays where you can go to a local market and say, this play's made for you. It won't sell anywhere else, but it'll sell for you.
Here, yeah.
Literally, my next project is based on that principle of just going, we've got an angle. We're going to do that. Okay, we have been chatting for a fair while now. I think we've barely scratched the surface. Frankly, we've made an opening gambit. I think we should circle round to the title and/or change the title.
Yeah.
because this does turn up in our exploring sessions a lot. We have touched on it, but it's one of those things that every so often someone will make that suggestion. Well, why don't we change the gender of the cast? Why don't we gender swap? And maybe that'll. And to a degree, what that does is it takes the immediate sting out of a tale, in terms of audience reception. It doesn't, however, solve the problem,
No.
as it were. What we're talking about is just sugaring the pill, and maybe highlighting the issues of the text on some level, but it's not a catch-all solution to things.
No, I describe it in the article as like one tool in the arsenal of a director who wants to address these issues in a production. And I should say too, like, I think there's the premise of incomplete dramaturgy is taking a production on its own terms, right? So I'm less concerned about productions that just want to. No, I'm not less concerned, but I think the principle of an incomplete dramaturgy applies less well in a context where somebody's just trying to do a so-called straight production of something, right? Where it's, cast in, where the genders of the actors align with the genders of the characters, and they're doing it in period dress, and they're not cutting very much, and it's just a sort of, museum piece performance. I think there's different critiques to make of that kind of practice.
Especially the fact that a whole series of choices have been made, even with that.
Exactly. These are not neutral choices.
No. All of those productions are inevitably cut in some way. And the audience isn't the original audience, which is another factor. Anyway, sorry.
Which is another factor. Yeah. So I think that's kind of a different conversation to have. What I'm talking about and interested in for the purposes of this particular bit of theorizing is productions that in some way are claiming to have a sort of progressive or social justice cred, who've done very little to actually address how these things show up in the play. And often that is just throwing a woman at it. There's a great bit in the introduction to Pascal Abisher's first book, Shakespeare's Violated Bodies, where she talks about the sort of ghostly appearance of a gravedigger's daughter in that famous clown scene by He Who Shall Not Be Named. But what's super interesting about that is what she's talking about is the way that she sort of imagines, right, the director making this choice and then noticing the way that this choice has rippling implications for the rest of the play, and then unmaking that choice. So even in this kind of relatively minor character who only has one scene, the dramaturgical effect of that for the world of the play is outsized to the number of lines that character might have. And the effects get bigger, the bigger the role. So if we can't imagine, a woman playing, I'm trying to think of a good example, like, who's the buddy, one of the, Socrates, is it Socrates or Sophocles? Sophocles in Tamer Tamed, isn't it? That's a bad example because he's really misogynist, but some kind of small role that has one scene. One of the Morris dancers, the unnamed Morris dancers in Witch of Edmonton, one of Cuddy Banks's buds. If we can't picture a woman in that kind of role, and we can't account for the way that shifts the society of Edmonton, how are we going to think about what a female Cuddy Banks might look like, or what a female Old Banks might look like, or what a female Frank might look like any of these things. And if we can't do that on a binary, we definitely can't do that when we start thinking about gender as a more expansive and fluid concept. And if we can't do it in relation to gender, then I really question our ability to do it in terms of race. And this is something that lots and lots of scholars and artists of color have talked about. Justin Emeka is my go-to citation on this. He talks about being in a production of Our Town and being the only Black actor in the cast, and asking the director, so how does race function in this town? What are the semiotics of race in this version of this world? And the director was really flummoxed and didn't know how to answer that. And I think that would be true for most productions of early modern plays that are doing, so-called colorblind casting as well. And so it's about sort of holding productions to account on those terms, right? Saying, if this is what you want to do, actually do it. And don't just throw a woman at it.
Yeah. Right, this is time for you to make plugs for your things. You can mention if the unmentionable is within the title of the thing. That's fine. Just don't go off too long about it.
Oh, the unmentionable is in the title mostly for marketing purposes.
We do not approve of such things.
No, you would never. You would never. The book is kind of the anti this guy book. It's a real critique of that guy. Not that guy as a person, but that guy's plays as they show up in our world now. It's called Canonical Misogyny, Shakespeare and Dramaturgies of Sexual Violence, and it's out from Edinburgh University Press in December.
December 2024.
December 2024,
in
yes.
the future.
For those in the future, it might already exist in your world. What an exciting idea. And it's the reason that it's about that guy and not all these other guys, or indeed some of the women, is that I really wanted to talk about canonicity, and the way to kind of do that without getting down too many tangential rabbit holes into the sort of alt canon, was to focus on just the one playwright this time. Plus, now that I've written one book, I can write whatever I want in the next one. So,
yes, and there is a whole discussion about the concept of canon, which would be quite. That's another day. We'll come back.
That's
to that.
Another conversation.
You also, I believe, live on a podcast at some point.
I do, yeah. So my the husband for whom I made significant life choices and I are celebrating 13 years together and 4 years of podcasting. So we have a podcast where again we're quite scathing towards that man. It's called Not Another Shakespeare Podcast, and it does have an exclamation point on the end. Basically the premise is that because James is a civilian in this world, we pick a play and I teach him about that play, and he reacts to it as a person who has, not been embedded in this world. And it got started because I was preparing a lecture on a play called, and I was testing out some of the talking points on James because he's very intelligent and very creative, but just isn't in our world. So he's a wonderful kind of intelligent non-expert to sort of test ideas with. And he stopped me and he said, wait a minute. I thought the title of this play was plural. And I was like, yeah. He said, but you've only mentioned like 2 women. And I was like, yeah, there's 2 and like there's kind of a third at the end. And he goes, so the minimum plural number of he goes, from the title I was expecting like a whole bunch of so he has good takes, and they really prompt me to look at things with fresh eyes, and it's quite fun, we like to think, along the way.
Yes, I approve of trying to get civilians in as much as possible.
Yes.
It's sort of the point of the exploring sessions, is to get people to just go, what? Sorry, what just happened there? Without that sort of, yes, well, of course, as you know, in Act 3, that's when the pivotal moment is. And trying to get that sense of actually, how would an audience respond to this? A modern audience respond to it.
Yeah, and who's our audience, right? Like, I think there's... there can be an assumption sometimes that the audience is like in on the joke already. I actually both anecdote.
And to be fair, both of them are. They're absolutely on it. The other people that
that we're worried about. When I was this would have been 2016, I think. There was a production of The White Devil on at the RSC, and I was like, who does The White Devil? Like, I got to go and see that. And I went, and I think it was still in the previews week. So it was, the word wasn't out totally yet, but it was a packed house in the Swan. And it got to the bit at the end where Flaminio seems to have died and hasn't actually. And he leaps up and
Spoilers,
his line is,
people. Spoilers.
Sorry, spoilers on this 400-year-old play. Well, this is the point, though. So he, they had guns in this project. They shoot him. It was a female actor playing the role. And she falls down and the scene carries on. And then she leaps up and goes, "You fools, I am not hurt." And the whole house just goes, And it was so joyful, because I knew that was going to happen. But how exciting to be in an early modern performance where most of the room didn't know what was going to happen already.
Yeah.
It's not an experience I've had very often, but that was a great, memorable one. And it was really cool.
Yeah.
So yes, bring in the civilians. Let them be surprised.
Well, this is the thing: is if you are, this is the fundamental question that we're constantly pushing, which is, if we're going to do a production of any of these plays, we need an audience base that is incredibly large. The audience base that already exists, who knows these plays, is very, very small, and I'm getting more data as to the precise limits of that audience base every year I do this. So you have to go out to people who have no idea what the plays are about, in which case you start going to the question, well, if they're coming to it completely fresh, they don't have the underpinning that we've just been talking about here. They're going to be going, sorry, why am I watching this? A lot of the time. And so you have to start thinking about how you're going to shape the play for that person, and how to make that happen, and say how to find those people, and find the markets, and find plays that you think are going to be marketable. I mean, often it's a case of going, the title's not very good, can we change the title? Because if nobody's already heard of it anyway, we can email both of the audience who know the play in advance, and they'll be fine, and they'll have something to complain about.
Yes.
You changed it. Why did you change the title? Nobody it's a terrible title.
Nobody knows that title.
Whereas at least with The Birth of Merlin, it's got a great title. You know exactly what it's about.
Great title.
Yeah.
And it's very, I think what's fun about The Birth of Merlin, and why I would pitch that it should be produced more often, is that it's dealing with a lot of things that will be familiar to probably any audience, right? Like, find me an English-speaking person who's never heard of Merlin.
Exactly.
And, who, and certainly in this country, who isn't sort of at least vaguely familiar with that kind of ancient history of the various different tribes fighting for power in the old version of this island.
And the play explicates what's going on perfectly well.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not
really
like you
clear.
need to turn up and know your Vortigans,
No, exactly. And they're all characters in their own right too. So it's not, the play, unlike perhaps something like a game at chess, is not making an assumption that the context for this. Yeah. Partly because it's really messing around with historically what may have happened, and it's kind of writing its own mythology. But it's so much fun, and it's really it's here and it's there and it's in Wales, and it's like the Welsh are like this whole third faction that come in,
and it's asking for spectacle, and people like spectacle, and it's asking for things that that are selling points in a play.
It's magical.
And there are
fun.
loads of plays that are like that, where actually people are just not. They're looking at it. Oh, this is a classic play, and no. This is bonkers fun.
Oh,
and
it's good fun.
It's full of stuff that anyone will enjoy, and you could quietly hide the fact that it's 400 years old a lot of the time, because it's not. It's not got the sort of deeply dense poetical, poetry in the way that as again we're going back to Middleton syntax.
Yes, we can cut some of that, and I think this is the other beauty of working with these kinds of plays in production, is that you do not you have the two people who know what it said in the quarto and care, and you have 98% of an audience who had no idea this existed before they showed up, so they don't mind if you mess around with it. They don't, and there's a lot of joy. I think it must have been 2013 or 14. I saw the adaptation of A Mad World, My Masters again in the Swan at the RSC, and so much of it that I thought for sure they have changed that, for sure they have updated that, because I hadn't read it before I saw it. Once I went back to the text, I was like, holy shit, that is a 400-year-old joke.
Yeah. And because there are two things to remember. I'm saying this to both of the people out there, is that first of all, secretly you're quite pleased to have something to complain about. That's part of your viewing experience, and embrace it, go with it. It's fine.
Like a Star Wars fan.
Yeah. The other point is that in everybody's head, everybody else's production gratuitously cuts or changes a text. Mm-hmm. But when you do it, you obviously understand it and you've made really responsible choices. So your cut is always perfectly... You're perfectly happy with cuts so long as they're your cuts, not somebody else's cuts.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is the blind spot that everybody has, actually.
Right.
I mean, we all go in.
It's part of the fun, and it's part of... I think also going back to what you were saying about, certain plays get a lot of productions and certain plays get very few productions. And this was part of the conversation when the Oxford Middleton edition came out as well. That was, much feted. When something is the only example of a thing, there's a lot of pressure on it to be the definitive example of that thing. And I think we can take that pressure off. These things are 400 years old, at least. They have survived all of that time. And you can go back. It's not like somebody, defaced the Mona Lisa and there's only one in the world and that's it.
Well, and again, that's part of our process. It's sort of baked in the sense that we try to start with the complete text and do at least one version that is complete. But then we usually do an edit that's better. So, for example, we have a plain text edit often with our audio adaptations, not always. So where I do a spoilers and I talk through things and go through the thing, and then here is a plain version. It's rough as hell, and we'll probably change bits of it, and there's occasionally some errors in it. And then there's the actual audio adaptation we release, which is usually about half an hour shorter because I've taken all the boring bits out, or at least my opinion of what the boring bits out. And you're more than welcome to put comments. Passive-aggressive abuse on the internet about why my choices are wrong. And that's fine, because that's what the internet is for.
Yes.
We've gone on considerably longer than planned, but that was fun.
So that was great.
All that remains to thank my wonderful guest for being wonderful. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Bye.